Oh, hello, Priyamvada Gopal. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, there's been a 30% rise in hate groups in the US. Are you seeing anything like this in England?
Absolutely. We have a rise in xenophobia, anti-migrant sentiment, racism, and a fair bit of what you've seen in America as well, something very closely resembling British nationalism, extreme nationalism, combined with white supremacism. It takes a slightly different form in Britain, but it is much the same thing. But I should say it's not just Britain, it's everywhere in the world, other places that I'm connected to, like India. There is a surge in ideologies of hate and exclusion, and it's very worrying. So America is not really alone in what it's experiencing at this point in time.
You know, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are apparently unalienable American rights we all possess as citizens. Here, let me look up real quick what natural rights are. Here's the wiki. Natural rights and legal rights are not dependent on laws of any particular government and are universal and inalienable. Natural law first appeared in ancient Greek philosophy, was referred to by Cicero, subsequently alluded to in the Bible, then developed in the Middle Ages by philosophers such as Thomas Aquinas, then during the Age of Enlightenment was used to challenge the divine right of kings, becoming an alternative justification for the establishment of a social contract in the form of classical republicanism. Conversely, the concept of natural rights is used to challenge the legitimacy of establishments. You know, this is so tragic because as I read this, I'm reminded of my cultural duty to consume without accumulating wealth.
The pursuit of liberty is all-consuming.
Certainly in the pursuit of liberty as I suppose outlined in the American Constitution, or the ways in which the word liberty is used by many on the political spectrum, particularly on the right. It certainly is tied up to the ownership of property. It's also tied up to capitalism in the sense of what are we as citizens free to do? Well, we're free to consume. So consumer choice becomes the foundational idea invoked when liberty is invoked. But I should say, and this is on the strength of the book that I've just written, is that liberty is a contested term and has always been a contested term, and it was contested right in what I've looked at, right from the period of slavery and anti-slavery into the age of empire and anti-colonialism. And what becomes very clear is that for instance, the ways in which ex-slaves in Jamaica visualize freedom or liberty is deliberately oppositional and counter to what the slave owners and the colonial government consider to be liberty. Their definition of liberty, for instance, is that freed slaves should continue to work as waged employees on the plantations on which they were once enslaved. And freed slaves are very equally clear that that is not what they wish to do, that their idea of freedom is not to become a wage laborer, and that they see continuities between slavery and the kind of liberty that is being offered to them in the form of becoming wage laborers, as well as, of course, consumers. Their idea of liberty is tied up to owning a small patch of land and being able to be self-sustaining on it. So it still involves, in a sense, ownership, but it is not the liberal individual idea of property and kind of making money based on what you hold. The idea is very much tied up to being independent, or being self-sustaining, being not enthralled to an economic and political system that has once enslaved you. So yes, I think it is right to say that the mainstream understanding of liberty, particularly in America and particularly in the capitalist West, is tied up to the ownership of property, and it is tied up to the choices, the very narrow set of choices that you can make within capitalism in terms of, who you give your labor to and what you purchase. So yes, American white supremacy and American racial ideologies are absolutely to be tied back to slavery and also the kind of genocidal treatment of Native Americans, the indigenous peoples of this continent. So, the idea of whose bodies are dispensable, whose bodies are needed for labor, whose bodies are needed for other kinds of activity, and who gets to own property. These are racialized ideas. But I think it shifts in a global frame. The story has variations. So, yes, slavery is foundational in America and in the founding of American white supremacy, particularly through organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. But globally, race begins, to become an operative category from the Renaissance onwards. And it is an early modern category. It is a category that comes into operation, really, in one sense, as Europe starts to roam the world in search of resources, land, and markets. So, the so-called New World is racialized when Britain heads into Asia to find spices and resources and trading partnerships. The globe is then racialized in that direction. So I would say that race is a kind of a flexible idea which shifts in relation to different historical imperatives. So it takes particular forms on slave plantations. It takes different forms in relation to India and China, where you don't have slavery, but you do have bitter wars over land, trading rights, and resources. So, figuring the Chinese, for instance, as cunning and untrustworthy, absolutely tied up to the politics of trying to force open China, trying to get access to resources and trade in China, tied up to the Opium Wars. And you see variants of that today, where the so-called white working class is pitted against migrants and black people and ethnic minorities.
Vigilante behavior in general is a weird evangelical obsession with what others are doing, or policing the behavior of others. Karenism, if you will. But seriously, what about anarchy, self-policing, and how much responsibility should citizens shoulder in policing themselves?
I think it's right to say that any form of bringing citizens into the security apparatus, however informally or however loosely, is dangerous. And I think that we've seen across the board a rise in vigilante violence, whether that takes the form of people, as in Britain, for instance, reporting people who they suspect to be illegal migrants, or reporting people who they suspect of terrorism. I think the problem here is that it helps societies become polarized, divided, and shifts the burden of violence onto individuals against other individuals. So what it helps with really is the othering process that we talk about in relation to the rise of extremism and the rise of xenophobia. So I think that any shift in responsibility for surveillance or responsibility for criminalizing beyond the state is deeply dangerous. And I should say that I don't think that the state wields it with particular responsibility either. We know that in Britain, for instance, the surveillance apparatus on migrants in the form of the Go Home vans. I don't know if you know about this, but they were vans with big holdings that were touring the country saying, if you're illegal, leave before we find you, go home. And citizens were encouraged to report people who they suspected of being in the country illegally. And of course, the state apparatus has worked in ways that have been extremely brutalizing and oppressive. So I am very wary of anything that encourages citizens and subjects of the state to become arms of the state in relation to surveillance and policing.
A vigilante culture also reminds me of Foucault's panopticon and the belief in an all-seeing eye. It's evangelical in nature.
Yeah. And of course, a vigilante culture simply enforces that, simply increases that sense of being observed, and in ways that I think enact violence.
Yeah.